Well, we will start our first webinar in the framework of our Frontem network on time, at 3 o'clock, because we have a long afternoon before us. And I would like to first welcome everyone to this first event, which we can organize only online in the framework of our network. For the moment, the other events, unfortunately, we always had to postpone them, but I am quite confident that the situation of the pandemic is going to ameliorate, so that we can start to have some of our events in the autumn again, en présentiel, as we say. Hello, Joachim, I see you arrive. That's nice that you're here. I would like to welcome everyone. Hello, Jean. Hello, Martin, Bernard, Paula, our friends from the CESCI. Mary is there. Also, Anthony, I can see. Thank you very much for joining us. And we have added this event to our program in Frontem, because when we applied for Frontem there was no pandemic, so this webinar is now called Experiences Borders in Times of COVID-19. I think it is a very important subject for our network, because managing borders in the pandemic is not really like managing borders in times of, in normal times, when we have a Europe without borders and where we have free circulation in the Schengen area. So every one of us has experienced, more or less, if you live at a border region, and a lot of you live at border regions, this very strange situation of bordering, debordering, rebordering and debordering again under different forms. And I think it has already been a very interesting, but sometimes also traumatizing experience. Joachim and myself have had a first event here in the framework of the Center of Excellence, where we have witnessed our experience as border lenders in the Franco-German border. But today we would like to enlarge these experiences to all our 7 border regions, and then end with a comparison with our Canadian friends, who are going to join us a little bit later, because it's a bit early for them in the morning or it's still in the night, so they will come a little bit later. And so without, I would also like to thank Frédéric, who is on my side and who will stay the whole afternoon and the evening here with me, and we co-animate these debates. The second, as you know, will start at 6 o'clock on health issues at European borders, also a very important subject. Frédéric, would you like to say 1 or 2 words as an introduction before we start with Jean?
Thank you, Birte. Yes, we will meet just after at 6 o'clock on another link. It will be in French, and the idea is to discuss a little bit the reality of borders in time of pandemia, and to confront practitioners with other analyses, and to try to assess what is the situation nowadays. So that's why we thought it was a good idea to have the 2 événements together. So do not hesitate to connect at 6 o'clock for the webinar.
There is a different link for the second event, but it kind of carries on. We have a small break, and then we start with a panel at 6. So without waiting any longer, I have the pleasure to give the floor to Jean Peyrony, who has agreed on doing the introduction, because the Mission Opérationnelle has actually conducted a study, a first study on the effects of the pandemic on borders. And so, Jean, you have the floor to present this study with your PowerPoint. And for this, we have enabled you, you should be and you should just if you type on partager l'écran, yeah, that's it. Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
You have the floor, Jean. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Birte. Good afternoon to everyone. Yes, I will try to give a sort of general flavor of what happened in the first semester of last year, and my presentation will be based on a study that we did for DG Regio. Yes, you see my slide.
Jean, if you put présenter à partir du début, we have the slides because now we can see the slides on the left hand side. If you can commencer à partir du début du PowerPoint, si tu peux faire ça encore dans la présentation, ça sera mieux.
Ou plein écran.
Ou plein écran.
C'est-à-dire, je ne comprends pas.
Si tu mets.
Plein écran, oui, ok. Alors, oui.
Ou montrer le diaporama à partir du début en plein écran. Normalement, ce devrait être possible de le faire. Voilà,
okay.
C'est ça c'est mieux. Ça ouais, c'est mieux comme ça. Ok.
Ok, d'accord. Ok. Oui, so okay. Yes, I refer to the period of the spring 2020. Of course, many things I will say are still valid after, but what we studied was this period. It was for all the internal land borders of Europe, including countries like Switzerland, for instance. It was also based on the first report that we did for the French borders, and we worked also, thank you to them, with ABR and with CESCI to complete, of course, the coverage of Europe. And the four main tasks were first to map the measures taken on each border, then to try to measure the impact on cross-border communities, and we did a number of detailed case studies. We had a look at the role of the cross-border structures, or at least at the cross-border governance, because it's not always structures. And we end by some lessons and recommendations, and I will more focus on these lessons and recommendations, because I will keep the time in due constraint. So yes, we did 21 interviews, mainly cross-border structures, but also some information points, some municipalities. And we worked with also with the resource available at the time. So you see on the map the different borders, and of course I will not detail, because you after my presentation, some of you will present much more detailed case studies. So the first part of the study was to see in each country what happened from a legal or from administrative point of view. So we did for each country this sort of diagrams. Of course, you can access them on the website of the DG Regio. Basically, the lesson is that most states close their borders unilaterally without coordination with the neighbors. Some notified to the Commission, some not, because the Commission wanted us to monitor where the countries did they apply the Schengen rules, and so many of them didn't, in fact. And you had also often cases of dual borders, meaning that the openness of the border, or the fact that it was closed, was not symmetric, because at each time you have two countries on one border, of course. So yes, and we did these sort of diagrams again for each border, and we tried to explain who did what when. I mean, when did each country close the border and then reopen it, and different intensities, I would say, on closing and reopening. I of course will not detail that, but you can access to all these informations on the website. Then we made a study more qualitative to try to understand the impact on mobility, on specifically cross-border workers, on the users of cross-border public services, on economic activities, on social and cultural activities. And we tried also to have an idea of the acceptance of citizens about these measures. And so in the report, there are many photographies and so on, but okay. And just to give an example, but I will not present it just now, we made these case studies and we made some fish like this one on the border between Spain and Portugal, trying to mix quantitative and qualitative information. And yes, we had this focus on some of these cross-border structures that were quite active during the pandemic, but I will not present it in general. I will rather draw some conclusions and draw some lessons and recommendations of all this study. So now I enter the core of my presentation. That will be a sort of a general lesson that we drew. First, of course, we tried to draw some lessons from all this material. And the first lesson is that in the future we should start from persons within local cross-border communities. So I detail a little bit. The people were hurt, and there is a question of vocabulary, because I mean, it's not only cross-border workers, for instance. At the beginning, many countries discovered that there were cross-border workers and they were allowed more or less to cross the border, but it's not only about workers, it's about all the dimensions of the people. And this is where I thought it was useful to use the concept of person, which is not a totally unknown concept, which has also a story, but I will not insist on that. But persons were hurt as, yes, economic actors, cross-border workers, because suddenly the cross-border mobility was limited. They were also hurt as users of cross-border public services, because these public services were the first to be interrupted. Again, of course, the difficulty is that everybody was hurt in every region of the world. So we cannot say always that the border inhabitants were the only one to suffer. They clearly suffered more, I would say, generally, and because yes, these public services, they closed. They were the first to be closed. But there are also other dimensions. For instance, there is we are all as individuals informed, or we try to be informed. And during this pandemic, we have been following information of what was happening in our countries, in the other countries, in the rest of the world. But one very clear thing is that on the borders, there was little or no information. There was no more cross-border information. You had information from your country, but not from the other side of the border. And of course, it was very difficult when for the people who have a cross-border life. You have also this dimension which is qualitative, which is the people in their ordinary life. Their action is inspired by culture, sometimes by religion, by ethic. But on the other hand, during the crisis, the cross-border communication was damaged and the trust was damaged. And suddenly you had, generally speaking, through the cross-border cooperation, you have good flows of inspiration crossing the border with all the story of the Interreg programs and so on. But suddenly the inspiration became bad because suddenly some people who crossed the border were considered by the other people on the other side as danger, as enemies, as something bad. And so this was really something that came out of all the interviews we did, that this common inspiration was damaged. Then you have also a very specific thing that very little people knew outside the border regions. It's that the people are linked across the borders. Sometimes they are engaged in couples or in families that cross the border. In the case, for instance, of elder people that are in houses that are the other side of the border, and suddenly these families were simply divided by the border. And finally, as citizens, of course, because suddenly we were only national citizens, because many restrictions were based on administrative criteria like ID cards, and suddenly there was no longer European citizenship. There was no longer cross-border citizenship. You were only national, and you were limited to what your national ID card allowed you. And this is again very important because it shows that there is a big difference between the theory of European citizenship and the reality of citizenship that remains something very, very national. So I sometimes mentioned some possible references to if we want to study a little bit more all that. And in that case, I would advise to refer to a French sociologist, Boltanski and Thévenot, who studied these different dimensions of existing in society, market, civic society, and so on. I think we have to focus on these multiple dimensions of life and also of cross-border life. Second idea in this lesson, all regions suffered, but cross-border regions suffered double penalty. And the idea is to consider persons within functional regions. Because the life of person is not only work or is not only health. It is the concrete life of cross-border citizens is to cross the border, to go to work, but also to stop in a shop or to stop to put a kid in a school, for instance. And it's a complex mobility chain. And again, it was very difficult for national administrations to understand that. But if we want to go to see the future, we have to refer to functional regions. And again, this is not new. I mean, there is an important European thinker with Denis de Rougemont, who from 1945 to 1980s was advocating these functional regions. And there again, we have to come back to these ideas if we want to be efficient in the future. So another lesson is, yes, to consider cross-border living areas and not only borderlines. And suddenly we rediscovered that borders are not only lines that were fading away. The lines came again, but if we want to act, we have to consider that borders are also living areas. And if we need an academic reference, there is all the work of Lapradel, who was writing in the 1920s or 30s, but he's rediscovered. I put a reference to Big Review, who made a paper about Lapradel. Third lesson is, yes, we have to build or to rebuild cross-border common evidence and trust. They are linked. We have trust because we know each other, and we can know each other because we trust each other. And evidence and trust have been jeopardized, and now we need to rebuild. Fourth lesson is, yes, the EGTCs and the cross-border governance, whether or not organized, were active and show the way. There are many models. On some borders, you have Euro-districts, like in the French-German border, and these Euro-districts were active. If you take the Irish border, Anthony will certainly tell us there is no Euro-district or EGTC, but there were nevertheless a good reaction of the cross-border governance. So many models, but this is very important to have some institutions, because persons acted, but persons can act in the long term only if there are institutions. And this is where Monet, what Monet told about EU in general is also true on the borders. Nothing possible without men, but nothing is lasting without institutions. So first series of actions, if we were asked to give recommendations. So basically, the recommendations would be give EGTCs or equivalent structures a prominent role in some functional fields, and some like emergency plans. They should prepare emergency plans for future crises and be able to make them work. This was not existing for this crisis. We have to develop cross-border public services and maintain them in case of crisis. This is the functional city. This is the working of the territory with services. You have to support centers to inform cross-border workers, cross-border consumers, businesses, and this is the city of market. You have also to develop and to maintain observation of what happens on the borders, and this is the city of information. You need to maintain and to develop some social and cultural common inspiration. You need also that people, individuals, persons link across the border, and this is where all the people-to-people projects and citizen projects have to be maintained and to contribute to rebuild the trust. And we also, of course, need this civic dimension in the cross-border context to have some organization of the not only of a governance, but to link the cross-border governance with involvement of citizens. And this is certainly a very important dimension. Another dimension is the multi-level dimension. Of course, it's very clear that the local areas suffered and that the resource to overcome the difficulties has to be local. But on the other hand, the public action during this crisis has been very much at the national level, because when it is necessary to control mobility, as can be understood in the context of health pandemic, states are there. States have this prerogative, but they haven't, and they should in the future coordinate horizontally and vertically. So we really need to. We were of course already convinced of that, all of us. But the crisis showed that it was absolutely necessary to build or to develop a cross-border multi-level governance. National level matters. It's not against states. We certainly need sovereign states to manage crisis and to manage recovery, but they have to act together. There is to promote a cross-border development. I just give the example of French-Luxembourg border. As you know, you have massive flows of cross-border workers, which was necessary to maintain because some of them are making the Luxembourg health service work, and in other cases it was possible to continue the cross-border activity through cross-border teleworking, and certainly it would be an interesting option in the future. But it raises the question of taxation. So it's a very difficult question, but it's not possible to admit that in the future more and more French or German workers would work for a firm based in Luxembourg, would telework in France or in Germany, and have all the tax paid and kept in Luxembourg. It's simply not possible. So it shows that you have to involve the states. And another idea on that is we need to assume the diversity and the complexity of borders. So each border is specific, but we have nevertheless to act at national and to act at European level. We need this reinforcement of multi-level governance. So there are examples like Aachen Treaty or Nordic Council that were not necessarily very efficient. but I would say for the Aachen Treaty, the crisis came at the moment when the treaty was starting its implementation, and it was certainly not perfect at the beginning, but it gave a sort of framework. Development of observation, I already told about that, but it involves also the states, and France and Germany now do it. And there is also a need to adapt member states' legislation to manage crisis in the context of COVID. And it's also about citizen rights and civil status. And there are new ideas that come now. For instance, the French and the Swiss diplomats have started to think about what could be a cross-border status through cross-border living areas conventions that would allow the cross-border inhabitants to go on across the border during their day life. And so I now speak about measures that have been taken early 2021. So it shows that we are starting to experiment new ideas. This is happening. Yes, and of course, finally, we have this European level. Certainly, EU should act more. Citizens would have liked more EU interventions from the start of the crisis. But the reality is that EU had a limited mandate, and so there is room to increase this mandate. EU should have a role to check that state action is fair and proportionate, which was not the case. And EU had at least a role in providing information and coordination. And we have certainly to deepen this multi-level framework. And this is also about states. Traditionally, in the field of Interreg, for instance, you have Interreg programs that discuss with the EU Commission, for instance, but we have also to embark in this system the states with their legislative and with their funding capacity. So concretely, what can be done? Certainly increase EU competencies on health and emergency situations. It's happening, and there is now a legislative process about that. We should work more on prospective research about cross-border functional regions and different scenarios. There will be a pilot project from the Parliament implemented by the Commission. This will happen, so we progress now. We have to progress on cross-border impact assessment procedures. That's one of the conclusions of the study. We have to think about a framework for cross-border public service. There is a recommendation from the Committee of the Regions that has been published. We need to have to systematize this multi-level dialogue between local, national, and European level. It should be the ECBM, but as probably you know, there are many difficulties to have the Council accept this ECBM regulation that would generalize in a way the system of the Aachen Treaty. But we have still to fight with states in the Council, and we have certainly also to pay attention to cross-border regions during the recovery. And beware, this is not really happening. We hear now that some missing links that are identified on some European borders. 1 year ago, states said, yes, we will reopen this, we will close these missing links, we will make this new railway, cross-border railway be built, but now just in 2021, states are less decided to do that. So it's really a fight we have to have in the month to come. Yes, Interreg can act, and I will not extend on that because many possibilities are there with the new Interreg programs and with the new objectives of Europe closer to citizens, territorial approach, governance, and this new objective, better cooperation governance. So I don't insist on that. And I will now conclude. Basically, border closures due to the COVID crisis have been, like the people in charge of assessments say, we have had a counterfactual of cross-border integration. We suddenly saw what it was to close the border, what effects, and it constitutes a proof that cross-border regions deserve EU special attention, as it's said in the treaty, because of the handicaps, that's to say cross-border obstacles, but also because of their potentials. Because when you solve obstacles and when you open the borders and when you keep the borders open, you have much potential. Second idea, that the crisis revealed interdependencies and it requires new cross-border policies. We need this functional approach considering persons in their cross-border living areas and a bottom-up multi-level governance. And the crisis has been is still a big danger, but also an opportunity, because the cross-border regions can claim to be test cases of EU integration. We have now the proof, I would say, with all the difficulties, that it's necessary to do something else, and we started to prove it, I would say. And I just wanted to finish by this process of alliance of cross-border citizens that we started together with ABR, MOD, CESCI, and many other stakeholders, like the network of the Euro-Institut. We are now in the cross-border alliance. The Committee of the Regions took it and is preparing a resolution that will be voted on the 1st of July this year, and it will be a contribution to the conference on the future of Europe. So I will end with that. There are many perspectives, and I think it's good now that you can certainly give more details about the different borders. And I will now finish with that and give back the micro to Birte.
Yes, thank you very much, Jean. I think this was really an excellent introduction for our webinar, and I really liked your conclusion in terms of that cross-border regions could be considered as testing places for European integrations, not only in good times, but also in crisis. I really like this. I would like to, I just wait for you to give back the hand of the PowerPoint.
I think it's done.
It's done, okay, perfect. So we are now going to give it to Melinda, but beforehand I would like to welcome Julia, because I've seen he's joined us, and our friends from Canada, Oliver and Emmanuel, and thank you so much for getting up so early for us. This is really nice of you. Thank you. Thanks a lot, the two of you, such faithful networkers. And without waiting any longer, I propose that we move on to the first two presentations, which will be the Romanian-Hungarian border and then the Franco-Belgian border. And then we will have a first discussion and then move on to the next two borders. So we can have a discussion after two borders each time. So it's not a succession of just presentations, because I think there's a lot of need for discussion too. So I think it's Melinda who's going to present for the Hungarian-Romanian border, right? Melinda, you have the floor.
That's right. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone from the rainy Budapest. Can you see my presentation and hear me well? Okay, perfect. Yes. I can see some notes. Okay, thank you. So my name is Melinda Benczi. I'm a strategic planner at Central European Service for Cross-Border Initiatives. And today I would like to share with you some of the most prominent experiences and analysis of the Romanian-Hungarian border during these times of COVID-19. I will do so by first introducing you to the specificities of the Romanian-Hungarian border, because as Jean very well said before, there are some general outcomes and learnings that we can see emerging because of this situation. But also, in order to deeply understand what's going on, we need to be familiar with the given border and their characteristics. Then I will explain to you what exactly happened, what were the main measures and when were they made during the pandemic, and then I will talk about the actual impact, socioeconomic impacts of these measures. All right, so where are we in time and space? The border between Hungary and Romania is actually a really fascinating one, as it has witnessed and has been molded by the most severe historical events of Europe. And due to these changes, the border region today has a very, very unique blend of characteristics. For instance, my own grandmother has lived in 3 different countries without actually moving out from her birthplace, birth city. So as you can see from the map on the left-hand side, the geomorphological characteristics of the border region are quite similar on both sides of the border, and it is largely characterized by plains and the lack of mountainous or rough or difficult area, which would make us think that it's easy and quick to cross the border and to travel from one country to another. But actually, along the nearly 450 kilometers long, so it's quite a long border section. At the moment, there are only about a dozen working border crossings. And that's because even though in the last years, 10 new roads and border crossings had been built, they are not yet been put into use. Because, and that's another very important characteristic, is that Romania is not yet in Schengen. So both countries are obviously in the EU, so it's an intra-EU border, but Hungary is in Schengen and Romania is not. So it's in order to operate these border crossings, certain infrastructural facilities and personnel is needed, and that's why they haven't opened all the border crossings yet. And probably that is what's reflected also on the second map that you can see. The European Commission published this map in 2019 and categorized this border section as one of the lower ones when it comes to cross-border network efficiency in Europe. Well, following the historical specificities, there is a considerable number of Hungarians living on the Romanian side of the border, about 500,000 close to the border and 1 million all in all. And that brings a series of different issues that need to be taken into consideration when we talk about cross-border cooperation. And this is also reflected by the second map, where you can see the density of town twinnings between Romania and Hungary, which shows quite a high level of interconnectedness. But of course, this ethnic situation also has its own sensitivities and challenges. Now, did I jump too? Yeah, I did. Okay, so let me jump back. There are 2 more maps that I would wanted to show you, because on the left-hand side, you can see the functional urban areas along the border, which also do not stop at the border. So people cross the border on a daily basis to work on the other side, or to take their children to school, or to shop, or use recreational facilities. So it's quite intertwined. And that's also represented by the other map on the right-hand side, which shows the level of institutionalization in terms of AGTCs and Euro regions. There are 8 in this border section. All right, so this is the context. Now let's see what happened during the pandemic. Of course, it was a quite hectic time with a lot of different decisions and very difficult and quickly evolving situations. So I'm not going to say everything, but just the most important milestones. And the first being that on the 17th of March last year, the border had been closed univocally by Hungary, meaning that only the Hungarian citizens could enter the country. But at the same time, on the same day, already a decision was made that a humanitarian transit corridor has been assigned for those Romanian and also Bulgarian citizens who are working in Europe, mostly Western Europe, and who suddenly wanted to come home, or a majority of them wanted to come home. And you can just imagine that from Romania, about 2 million people, so it's almost like the entire population of Slovenia are working abroad. And when that amount of people wanted to cross the borders in such a short period of time, that was quite challenging, and it caused several serious traffic jams and long waiting times, especially that these humanitarian transit corridors were functional, were open only during the nights to help to stop the spread of the virus. And then just not even 10 days after, another milestone was reached, because when the border suddenly closed, of course, everything around the border was paralyzed. People couldn't go to work, kids couldn't go to school, all these things was suddenly halted, and that had to be tackled somehow. So an agreement was reached between Romania and Hungary, that workers, cross-border workers, upon showing their work certificate or work certification, they can cross the border for 24 hours at a time and in a 30-kilometer zone. And that made life easier for a lot of people. And then, as the first wave started to pass, in May, the borders had been opened one by one, cautiously, and by the end of the month, end of the May, Hungary lifted all the restrictions on the border, and that kind of marked the end of the first wave. But now we already know that that wasn't the only wave. The second started over the summer, and because of that, on the 15th of July, Hungary and Romania, first Hungary, but not long after Romania also introduced a new system where they categorized the countries according to their infection rates into green, yellow, and red categories, and traveling was permitted without restrictions from green countries, so where the infection rates were low, with restrictions, so either with presenting a negative COVID test or undertaking compulsory quarantine from yellow countries, and it was entirely prohibited from red countries with very high infection rates. Hungary placed Romania into yellow category, so movement was possible, but with difficulties and with restrictions. Up until 1st of September, when the situation got so severe that Hungary again closed its borders. Foreign citizens could not enter the country, except of, and that's very important, that the transit traffic that I mentioned earlier and the freight traffic was upheld all along the pandemic, all along all the waves. So at that time, only Hungarian citizens could enter the country, and they could do so only if they went to quarantine for 2 weeks or until they produced 2 negative tests. And it's very interesting, and it's probably a uniqueness of this border section, that there was one exception, that due to the parliamentary elections held in Romania back at the end of last year, the Hungarian and the Romanian governments, both of them agreed to lift the restrictions and open the borders so people could go to Romania, cast their votes, and then return without going to complete a quarantine. This situation was only open for 2 days, so just for the elections. And then, since the second wave, a certain status quo developed, that persisted during the third wave too. So all the rules that I mentioned about the 24 hours and 30 kilometers and the work certificate were in use. And now a breakthrough very recently happened when the two countries agreed to accept each other's vaccination policy, meaning that if someone received their second shot vaccination, 10 days after that day, they can cross from Hungary to Romania or to from Romania to Hungary, even if, regardless of the type of vaccination that they have received. Now, over the weekend, I read some news and I heard some news that in practice, this might not entirely be smooth at the moment. So the situation is still evolving day by day. But the general direction, it's probably safe to say, is that the two countries will accept each other's plans and strive for smoothing the cross-border mobility. So in a nutshell, this is what happened so far. This is the easier part because we know what happened, we lived through it. Now the impact of all these measures is a bit of a different cup of tea because it's still early to say with certainty what are the economic impact of these measures. What is already visible, of course, that there are certain sectors that are more affected, especially cross-border service sectors. For instance, even the transportation. So from my hometown, before the pandemic, every day there were about 8-10 bus companies who ran buses between Hungary and Romania, and they entirely stopped during the past 1.5 years. But also there are already studies that are coming out to measure the impact. One of the earliest one was made by Gate to Europe EGTC. It was published last summer, and it measured the impact, the economic impact of the first wave. And even though they carried out surveys with their member municipalities, so mayors mostly filled out the survey, and they said that there was only one person in their municipalities who was affected by the virus during the first wave, but 70% of the people of their municipalities were affected by quarantine. So, and it was also shown that the unemployment increased in these municipalities already as the direct result of the coronavirus and the closure of the borders. And also 1/3 of these mayors claim that they can already see disruptions in cross-border contacts. The social side is again still under evaluation. We are just writing a study on it, so the results are not yet conclusive, but the general trend is that possibly there are some temporary changes. So for instance, the Csíksomlyó pilgrimage is a huge religious cultural event organized every year in Romania, where hundreds of thousands of people from Hungary visit every year. And of course, last year that was not possible. They had to organize it alternatively. And even this year, there will be very strict restrictions. So about 10% of the people can actually go compared to the usual amount of audience. But it is taught, and it is the interviews that we carried out showed that this is temporary. So once this pilgrimage will be organized again, those people who frequented before, they are going to go again. And similarly with tourism services, they had to stop, but there is still a demand that once they are open, people will go. But this is not the case with everything. For instance, as I mentioned, a lot of Hungarian families live in the Romanian side, and some of them decide to school their children in Hungary, especially if in their settlement there's no Hungarian language education available. Then they take their kids to the other side of the border. And because of what happened, their life was very difficult when there wasn't online schooling to cross the border with the children, or for kids to go to the to pass their high school leaving exam was sometimes problematic. And there are some voices saying that some parents might consider to actually select a Romanian school in the future to avoid similar difficulties in the future. And also with using cross-border services and or going to the other side of the border to shop, that's something that might suffer on the long run, because people had to find new habits, had to create new solutions for their day-to-day life in the past almost 1.5 years, and they might not go back to their original or previous ones. But at the same time, there are also things that seem to be so strongly embedded that they are not changed. And one is that the perception about the other side of the border. We prompted during these interviews the stakeholders to see whether they are maybe afraid of the other side, that the virus might come from both perspectives. So it's not one or the other, but it wasn't the case. So almost all of them said that it's one cross-border region with very similar infection rates. So it's not something that came down to the level of individuals' perception. And also the interest towards cross-border projects and initiatives are still there. There are even new projects that stem from this situation. For instance, the BTC, GTC organized the collection and sharing of hand sanitizers and personal protection equipment and these things, but also we see behind Jean's the logo of Cross-Border Citizens Alliance. That's another initiative that kind of resulted from, in a way, from this situation. But at the same time, it is true that for cross-border projects, not being able to meet is a huge challenge. Because of course, and there were attempts to put some of it to the online sphere and meet there and discuss and proceed with the project. But the very essence of cross-border projects is that people can meet and discuss and find project partners and develop ideas and get to know each other and have a real connection. And that was challenged by this situation. So it was visible that even some projects are kind of like waiting for the end of this situation. And there are also others who shifted slightly their priorities. For instance, there was this Interreg project 401 that was already dealing with healthcare challenges and problems, but they managed to relocate their funds and instead buy specific medical equipment to fight COVID-19. So in conclusion, what is visible from these experiences is that there is a serious need for mobility. So it's a very visible and bottom to top request that a lot of people, a lot of different groups of people with different ideas and also different needs want to cross the border in a daily basis. So for their needs need to be catered for. And that's why there is also a need for policy, a coordinated and consistent measures based on cooperation and quick decision-making that allows for these needs to be met. And for that, for example, this humanitarian corridor could be an example, or this one-day exemption, or these things. But in order for policy to be put in place in a way that it's actually helping people in the border areas, there is a very strong need for data and analysis. Because without that, it's very difficult to know what would be the right measures to do. And of course, in the past year or so, a lot of new studies appeared. I also put some examples on the slide in which CESCI was involved with, but there are also many other good ones. But at the same time, there is still the measurable data is still sometimes missing. Now we are writing a study on the effects of the coronavirus on the border regime, and we are also trying to use cellular mobile data. But all these methodologies and everything is still very much need to be created and figured out. So in a really small nutshell, this is what I wanted to share at first with you from the Hungarian-Romanian border. But I'm very much excited to hear the other presenters, so we can compare a little bit that this global phenomenon, which was the phenomenon itself was the same everywhere, how it manifested in the different parts of Europe. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Melinda. This was a very interesting presentation on your border, and I can already say that from the perspective of our border here, we could see some similarities and some differences. So I'm very excited for us to discuss the comparison. But before doing this, Bernard, it's you presenting for the Franco-Belgium border, and Melinda, you have to give us back the power of the presentation, so Bernard can share his PowerPoint with us.
Yes, I think I did so now. Is it
Bernard?
working?
Yes.
Okay.
So you have the floor, and if there are, some of you have already asked some questions in the chat, so if you want to do this, we will collect them for the first round of discussion after Bernard's intervention. Bernard, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Birte, for inviting me. I would, good afternoon or good morning to everybody, even to our Canadian friends. As a preamble, I would like to make a short remark. In fact, I live 50 kilometers from the border itself in Arras, so I don't have a direct experience of what happened at the border, but through professional relationships, my PhD candidates, press, consulting blogs, and with a daughter studying in a university in Belgium, I could collect some information. So I won't make a scientific analysis on what was happening on the French-Belgian border, but I would like to share some impressions of somebody who lives not in a border region in itself. First of all, I would like to make a short presentation of the French-Belgian border, which is 620 kilometers long between the North Sea and the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg here. And on this map, you have the density of the population in northern France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and a part of Germany. And this border is divided into two parts for about half of its length from the North Sea, from west to east. It runs through densely populated and urbanized areas, and the Lille-Kortrijk Tournai Eurometropolis is thus a cross-border conurbation with almost 2 million inhabitants, and the eastern part of the border is occupied by a less densely populated and more rural area. You have here the Ardennes Massif. Over its entire length, the border is archetype of an open border characterized by intense cross-border relations and exchanges with very diverse motivations: work, trade, leisure, family, study, etc. May I share some general impressions? I have the feeling of a more complex situation from autumn 2020 onwards, as differences and rapid changes with adjustments are noticeable. The border seems more porous than during the first lockdown in spring 2020. I think the main difference is that we move from a situation where we were almost certain not to be able to cross the border to an ambiguous situation. We never know if it's possible to cross the border, and if we cross it in one direction, we are not sure to be able to cross it in the other direction. So I will present more a point of view, a French point of view, than a general overview on what happens on the border itself. Firstly, some general similarities can be observed on certain periods of traffic restrictions on both sides of the border, but with different modalities. The first lockdown and decontainment started and ended at about the same time in Belgium and in France, mid-March, and between mid-March and the first half of May. It was quite similarly for border travel restrictions from mid-March to mid-June. A second lockdown started at approximately the same time, end of October, but again with different modalities. However, an analysis of the daily newspapers and blog shows a great deal of perplexity among the inhabitants living near the border after the start of the second lockdown and in the recent time. For example, recently, La Voix du Nord of the 26th April 2021, a daily newspaper published in Lille, mentions the opening of shops in Belgium on the same day with a real question: can the French take advantage of this? Restrictions on travel still exist on French territory. People can travel within a 30 kilometers radius of their home for essential reasons, like hairdresser, going in shops for buying food, etc. French nationals are allowed, therefore, to cross the border, but checkpoints are carried out at the main border crossing points on return to France. It is therefore necessary to have an attestation, the form for which can be found on the French government's website, to fill it in and sign it, selecting the right reasons provided. The authorities carry out permanent controls, but nothing is said about the fines distributed and the number of people sanctioned. The situation is all the more misunderstood on the French side, as it seems that the situation is managed from is managed very differently between Flanders and Wallonia. Here on the map, you see that curfews are not established at the same time slots. It started at 6 o'clock p.m. in France, 10 p.m. in Wallonia, and only at midnight in Flanders. And as you can see, the night is very short. In this region of Flanders, curfew ends at 5 p.m. and only at 6 a.m. In France and Wallonia. The French-Belgian border is therefore not uniform. Some local authorities publish information on their websites for inhabitants and border residents. For instance, the Eurometropolis, Lille, Kortrijk, Tournai. Here you have a document which was published by the Eurometropolis. The title of the document is "What Can I Do Within the Eurometropolis?" The main reasons for crossing the border are mentioned: to go to work, to go to a restaurant, to see friends or family, to study. The document has been updated regularly, but it is not valid for the entire Franco-Belgian border, only a small cross-border area. Thus, in the latest document, border workers can cross the border, but teleworking is widely recommended. It is even possible to cross the border for health reasons, but of course, we can address the question, which type of health reasons? In several cases, shop owners in urban areas close to the border are reminding their customers that they were open, or in some cases, French shopkeepers reminded them that they were located in France and not in Belgium. This is the case in Moucron. Here you have the the urban area of Lille, Kortrijk and Tournai, and Moucron is a Belgian city very close of the border, a town of 60,000 inhabitants, which is just adjacent to the border and is very much frequented by the French. In Moucron or in the coastal region or in Mont-Noir, which is a cross-border holiday resort located between Lille and Dunkirk, with shops on both sides of the border. While the border was invisible to the people who frequented these places, the restrictions remind them of the existence of the border and materialize it in space. However, in the cross-border conurbations between Moucron and Tournai, here, or between Halouin and Menin, here, or between the two cities of Comines, many observers mentioned traveling during the curfew period. The proximity of the border in a dense area therefore allows a certain amount of play. It is difficult, if not unthinkable, for the authorities to control all crossings in this densely urbanized areas. Last, in Belgium, the General Health Consultation Committee, which brings together the government and the federated bodies, regularly publishes a map with zones represented in different colors. For example, it is forbidden to travel to the zones in red. This was the case for the region of Dunkirk, which is located in the northern part of France, on the North Sea coast in mid-February of this year, while the incidence rate was about 1,000 per 100,000 inhabitants. Well, 1%, which is very, very high. The region was placed under weekend lockdown, and from that date by the French government, which significantly reduced travel over the first few weekends. Checkpoints were carried out by the authorities both on the French-Belgian border, here, but also with other French areas in the same or neighboring departments like Pas-de-Calais. At the same time, transfers of patients from Dunkirk's hospital to other hospitals in the north of France, in Normandy, for instance, but not to Belgium, were carried out. From this few observations, we can draw some partial conclusions. First, national governments have implemented measures to restrict travel across borders, but these measures change and evolve over time. There is no symmetry in the measures taken on both sides of the border. Understanding how to circulate, therefore, requires constant consultation of information, and this is what some actors, particularly institutions and newspapers, do. They want to inform inhabitants living on the border. However, movements have not stopped completely. Flows continue to exist, sometimes even if they were short, and especially after the first lockdown, but the journeys are shorter. In cross-border urban spaces, there was a feeling that the life of the border has been reduced to a micro-level scale in the cross-border urban areas. In general, the border is crossed by a multitude of links, roads, railways, etc., and it seems unthinkable or improbable to be able to control it continuously and permanently. The will, I think, personally, that the will to cross the border seems to remain intact for many people living near the borders. And the question remains for people like me who live further away from the border, if I can cross again this border very regularly, as it was the case before 2020. So thank you for your attention. And of course, I am open to questions.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Oh. Okay. Thank you very much, Bernard, also for having kept a strict measure of the time. I would like to, it is very interesting to for the comparison, your presentations, because you can really see some parallels, and I especially think that the multiplicity of different rules which Bernard showed from the curfew times, we have that in all type of border regions, sometimes even internally, for example, in Germany, between the Länder. And I wonder whether the European people, the European citizen, still finds his or her way out of these multiple rules, which also change in time very often. So do you understand still anything about how and if you can cross the border, and when, and for which purpose? There was one question for Melinda in the chat, which was about especially about the impact of the Schengen border, and one for Jean, which was for the introduction. But I still want to give a question about the pilot projects of the European Parliament. So, if the two of you would like to just give some insight on these two aspects, maybe Jean first on the European Parliament's pilot projects.
Yes, okay. Perhaps you know that the Parliament can propose pilot projects, and there was last year a sort of competitive process to choose these pilot projects. Anne Sander, who is very committed, as you know, to cross-border cooperation, proposed a project to debrief the COVID and to develop new policies and to explore functional cross-border regions, what could be cross-border public services, how to solve obstacles, and so on. And the project was voted by the Parliament and should now be implemented through the Commission in the months to come. So it hasn't started yet. But it will be an opportunity it will give the Commission some possibility to study a number of facts, not only about the crisis, but to start from the statements of the crisis and to think of new cross-border policies. If you want to know more about that, I think you should ask either Anne Sander or the Commission.
Thank you, Jean. Melinda, I've seen you have partially answered in the chat, but do you still wish to say something on the topic?
Yeah, sure, especially because if someone is following over YouTube, then they might not see the chat. So the question was that whether there was always checks at the border, and the answer is yes, because Romania is not in Schengen yet. There was always, the border controls always checked people's passport or national ID, but it was much quicker because nothing else, so no COVID tests or work permits or anything else needed to be checked before the pandemic. And the other question was about the Romania's joining the Schengen. It's a very surprisingly long process. And there's now a lot of discussion, especially within Romania, about the reasons and when this should be resolved. The Prime Minister stated in February this year, if I remember correctly, that he really wishes and hopes that by the end of this year, Romania will be accepted a Schengen member country. And also the European Commission was supporting him in this statement, but there are always member states that are voting against it. So there's no one specific reason why this haven't happened yet, but hopefully really soon this process of discussions and negotiations will come to a conclusion, and Romania will also join the Schengen area.
Thank you, Melinda. If you have further questions, then please do not hesitate to add them in the chat, and I will take them up again after the presentations of our next two border regions. So the first one is the Northern Ireland border, and I think it's Anthony. And are you presenting on your and Mary? Are you both of you presenting?
No, Katy will be.
Oh, Katy, sorry, Katy. Yes. I saw Mary on the. Sorry about this. So, who is going to show the PowerPoint?
It will be me.
Okay. We have a perfect trio from the Northern Ireland border, and I think you should, Anthony, have a look if you can. Bernard is giving you back the possibility, so you should be able to show the PowerPoint now.
Not yet.
Not yet.
It's still closed.
Bernard, you have to give us back the power.
It's done.
It's done. Okay.
It's done. Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Merci. Anthony, you okay?
Yet. I can still see Bernard is appearing as host in the. If you look at the participants list.
Yeah, you have to do it again, Bernard.
Okay, I will. Hold on. Here, I've done it again. Does it work this time?
Apparently not.
No? But
Yes, it is.
okay.
Merci, thank you.
Merci, Bernard. Hopefully people can see that, or not yet.
It's not yet, but I think it's...
To the right.
No, it's...
Hold on.
You have to try again, Anthony.
Sorry.
Yeah, now it's good.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
perfect.
Sorry about that. So good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our Canadian colleagues. Yes, I'm just going to do this presentation to begin with, and then my esteemed colleague, Professor Katy Hayward from Queen's University Belfast, will be giving us her insights very shortly. But before I begin, it's perhaps just to give you a bit of context. I mean, it's become already really apparent just in the few presentations that we've had from the various border regions. Really, during the course of this pandemic, we've become extremely conscious of how differences in approaches, and particularly in the timing of the introduction of public health measures by different member states and different regions, really impact on cross-border territories and their citizens. It's really in terms of the differences of when regulations are introduced and when they're lifted that we can really see the impacts on cross-border territories. And I'm going to kind of give you an overview of some of the experiences of that in terms of the Northern Ireland border region. But just before I do that, it's important to stress that one of the things that really has come out of this is the added, I would say, value, or hopefully added value, of undertaking cross-border impact assessments of regulations, but as they're being developed. I think this really has shown how we need to do cross-border impact assessments when regulations, when legislation is being introduced, to see what the impact will be on our border regions. But the other thing that's really come out, for example, I remember Jean interviewing me when he was doing his work for the MOT on COVID and the impacts on border regions. And he interviewed me some time ago. And it's the speed at which the pandemic, the course of the change of the pandemic in terms of its spread of the virus and in terms of vaccination rates, things are constantly changing in terms of the pandemic and how we've approached in terms of combating it. But the other thing that we've also seen, but I would say it's not necessarily unique to our own border region, but it's also in terms of the changes of the political context. And I can tell you that here in our border region, the political context has changed a lot since March of last year. And that has kind of affected some of the issues that I'll be addressing here today. So taking us back perhaps to the beginning, the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic and coming to today. So after initially seeming to have weathered the initial wave of the pandemic in comparison to other European regions, the island of Ireland went on to experience a really worrying increase in the rate of infections, with Northern Ireland in particular recording extremely high rates of infection. This is during towards the end of the first wave of the pandemic. But now we've seen that in the current situation, so bringing it up to date, the situation really has changed significantly, with the rates of infections decreasing in both jurisdictions on the island of Ireland, although with some localized incidences of higher rates, as in parts of the northwest of the island. So in the northwest in terms of both sides of the border. And if you look at the map on the right-hand side, unfortunately, that's a reflection of where we are following the end of the Brexit transition. You will see now that Northern Ireland, it does not appear on the ECDC map. It's a blank along with the rest of the UK, just a sign of the times that we're in now. The rollout of vaccination programs in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland has undoubtedly been the primary factor in providing us with the current context in terms of lower rates of infection, although the differing rates, the different speeds of the rollouts has meant differences in the percentages of the two populations who have received vaccines. So in Northern Ireland, there's a larger percentage of the population that has received first and second doses of the vaccine as compared to the Republic of Ireland. And that brings its own, let's say, challenges in terms of cross-border movement and the cross-border territory. Since the first case of COVID-19 was recorded on the island of Ireland in late February 2020, and it was actually the case of a woman who was from Northern Ireland, and she was returning from her holidays abroad, and she flew in to Dublin Airport. And once she arrived at Dublin Airport, she then travelled by train from Dublin across into Northern Ireland. So she crossed then the border into Northern Ireland. So really a cross-border case here in terms of the first case, recorded case of COVID-19 on the island of Ireland. But since then, since February of 2020, there have been repeated calls to treat the island as a single epidemiological unit. It kind of makes sense geographically. One island treated as one epidemiological unit, regardless of the fact that it is an island that contains two separate jurisdictions with two separate governments. Although bearing in mind that one of those governments is a sub-national government, a devolved administration, which in turn means it only has some competences in terms of addressing the challenges of the spread of this pandemic. At the same time, given the existence of a jurisdictional border, there have been regular calls for the authorities to reduce cross-border traffic in order to prevent the spread of the virus. So every now and again, you'll hear these calls for there to be controls of traffic crossing the border. So we saw this, for example, during the Easter holiday period in 2020, when the police services on either side of the Northern Ireland border attempted to discourage unnecessary cross-border travel. So they were there to discourage people from crossing the border at that peak period, that holiday peak period. Those calls were then again renewed as the rate of infection in the Northern Ireland local government area of Derry and Strabane, which is on the border with the Irish county of Donegal, accelerated at an alarming rate during the second wave of the pandemic. So as that local government district in Northern Ireland, you saw the rates of infection really increase. Then you heard again calls for cross-border movement of travel to be stopped. And they've been heard again more recently because of the different rates of the rollout of the vaccine programs in the two jurisdictions. So now there are calls again on the Northern Ireland side to introduce controls at the border because of the slower rate of the rollout of vaccines on the southern side of the border. And if we actually look then and look at the kind of the cross-border traffic, look at the data. So this is data that gathered from control points at the major crossing points between Ireland and Northern Ireland, looking at cross-border traffic. During the first wave of the pandemic, we really did see a significant fall in the flows of cross-border traffic. And the largest decrease recorded in any single month occurred in April 2020, when lockdown measures and restrictions were at their most rigorous, resulting in a 70% reduction in the total number of cross-border journeys. So we really did see a huge fall in the amount of journeys across the Northern Ireland border. But since January of 2021, since January of this year, we've seen really a steady recovery of cross-border traffic. It's not going to increase at a huge rate, but you can really see a steady recovery in terms of more and more people starting to cross the border along those border crossing points. The worsening situation towards the end of 2020 led to the chief medical officers of the two jurisdictions of Ireland and Northern Ireland coming together and issuing a joint statement advising against cross-border travel. And at the same time, we saw the activation of police checkpoints on routes between Derry and Donegal, so that's in the northwest corner of the island of Ireland, But those checkpoints were really on the southern side, only on the Irish side of the border, not on the Northern Ireland side. And again, earlier this year, we saw new regulations introduced in the Republic of Ireland that meant that Northern Ireland residents could be fined if they were stopped trying to cross the border without what's called reasonable excuse. And that's the first time that has happened since the outbreak of the pandemic. So it's something that perhaps you're more familiar with in other border regions, but it's not something that we had seen at the Northern Ireland border. So what we've seen in this border region, the Northern Ireland border region, is really confusion among citizens. When we go down to the level of citizens, we really do see confusion. And that confusion has arisen as, like everywhere else, it's when one of the two jurisdictions, one side of the border, imposes restrictions, such as when we saw the closure of all educational settings in the Republic of Ireland in mid-March of 2020. And then those restrictions only happen at a later date in the other jurisdiction. As soon as that starts to happen, we see restrictions imposed on one side of the border, but not the other. That starts to lead to confusion. And then that confusion is increased or also arises when public health restrictions are lifted. And you start to see the easier restrictions. And it only happens on one side of the border, but those restrictions remain in place on the other side. And this sometimes means that businesses see themselves as losing out to their competition on the other side of the border. And you also see at these times calls to control cross-border movement happen again, as citizens on one side of the border are seen as tempted to cross into the other jurisdiction to take advantage of the availability of services not open to them on their own side of the border. And sometimes this is a temptation because the restrictions actually mean people should not be crossing the border. They shouldn't be moving beyond a certain distance beyond their place of residence or outside of their own local government district. In terms of economic shocks, as is so often the case, and now we're talking about pandemic, but as is so often the case, the border region looks set to be severely economically impacted by the pandemic. So, for example, a study that was undertaken by the 3 regional assemblies in the Republic of Ireland concluded that the border region would be one of the regions to suffer most economically as a result of the pandemic, due to the makeup of its business landscape. So the types of businesses that tend to be placed in the border are exactly the types of businesses that see the greatest impact in terms of COVID. And the picture is very similar on the other side of the border, leading to one of the chief executives that was interviewed for work they were undertaking on this issue, raise a concern about the combined impacts of COVID-19 and Brexit on cross-border trade and relationships. So it's a double whammy, COVID and Brexit impacting on business in the border region. So in terms of North-South cooperation, between the two jurisdictions, while there have been these repeated calls for the island to be treated as one single epidemiological unit, there has been some evidence of cooperation between the authorities in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland in terms of combating the spread of the virus. So it's really crucial in this respect to note that health is one of the areas of cooperation under the formal institution for cooperation between the governments of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which is the North-South Ministerial Council, which was established as a result of the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. Health is one of the areas of cooperation for the two governments. In terms of the more visible outworkings of formal cooperation, on the 7th of April of 2020, the two departments of health signed a memorandum of understanding. And another product of a cross-border approach to the pandemic was the launch in July 2020 of Ireland and Northern Ireland's respective contact tracing mobile phone apps. Although they were launched separately, they were developed by the same firm and were designed to be interoperable and allow them to work on a cross-border basis. But despite these instances of cross-border cooperation, there is a need for much greater intensification if we're properly to address the coronavirus pandemic and the recovery from the pandemic. So as Dr. Gabriel Scally, a leading epidemiologist, has noted, and quoting directly from him, we have within our grasp a chance to suppress the virus across the whole of our island. Doing so will require political courage and statecraft of the highest level. We should be vocally demanding that our politicians, north and south, step up to the plate. It doesn't appear, however, as if all our politicians in Northern Ireland are necessarily able to step up to the plate, in terms at least of cooperating with their counterparts in the Republic of Ireland. As a consequence of the ongoing fallout from Brexit, unionist parties in Northern Ireland have become increasingly hostile to cross-border cooperation, with those who were contending for leadership positions wishing to demonstrate their opposition. So maybe you're not all aware, but the two largest unionist parties in Northern Ireland have both changed leaders just recently. So on Friday, we had the election of the new leader of the DUP, which is the largest party. It's the party from which we have the First Minister of Northern Ireland. The competition there was between Sir Geoffrey Donaldson in the photograph here and his rival Edwin Poots. Edwin Poots actually won. He is now the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party. But part of the argument there in terms of trying to vie for that leadership is how oppositional they are to North-South cooperation. So this is what I mean by it doesn't really bode well in terms of North-South cooperation going forward. But the person who can really give you an insight into all of this in terms of the political blockages and in terms of Brexit and how that influences perhaps things in terms of COVID is my colleague, Professor Katy Hayward from Queen's University of Belfast. And I'm going to ask Katy now to come in and give us some of her insight.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I'm just going to complicate matters even further by talking about Northern Ireland's other border, which is essentially the sea border, which many people are much more aware of now than they used to be across Europe, I think. So it's just to put this in context and just draw out some few lessons and insights in relation to borders in a context of a pandemic. So in terms of the governance of Northern Ireland, in response to the coronavirus pandemic, they're operating on two fronts, the sea border and the land border, because of course Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom state, but it's also of course part of the territory of the island of Ireland. And this reveals really interesting things, I think, about different types of borders and managing them. And of course, Northern Ireland being integrated with both Britain and Ireland, it brings practical as well as political challenges. As Anthony mentioned, the first case in Northern Ireland was somebody flying in via Dublin, but the second case was somebody coming directly into Northern Ireland from Britain, which sort of exemplifies the challenges here. So the United Kingdom, of course, is complicated in that it's made up of 4 countries with devolved powers, but also something that's been revealed in an interesting way in this coronavirus pandemic are the importance of regional authorities and local authorities within England itself. So you see increasing diversity within the United Kingdom, which gives rise to all sorts of challenges in relation to new forms of bordering. Interestingly enough, in 2016, there was a kind of war planning by the UK government, and a secret exercise in relation to what they would do if there was to be a flu pandemic, Exercise Cygnus it was called. And this revealed all sorts of shortcomings, but most particularly something that wasn't necessarily picked up on at the time. It showed the need for cross-government planning within the United Kingdom, because so oftentimes decisions were made centrally without consulting with the component parts of the UK. Of course, this included Northern Ireland. And we've seen from the coronavirus pandemic, there are practical challenges in relation to borders as lines of connection, of course, but there are also bureaucratic ones, and there's also, you'll be unsurprised to hear, political tensions as well. So in some ways, these devolved governments, which retain powers in relation to health and justice, very crucial to managing the pandemic, they're better placed for dealing with its outcomes. But at the same time, they're completely dependent on the central government for financial assistance and for coordination. And this is why we see new challenges in relation to borders in a context of a pandemic. It's worth bearing in mind that the devolution model within the UK was never intended to manage a crisis, and such a crisis wasn't envisaged. And we saw with that Exercise Cygnus that it was exposed that the UK government is very bad at coordinating with the governments on a day-to-day basis, but most particularly this was challenged in the context of a crisis. So this has really proven a challenge for the nature of the UK itself and for the relationship between central government and its and the component governments of the various parts of the UK. So just a few little points. The crisis revealed there's a sort of a centralizing instinct that comes in government in response to a crisis of this nature. But at the same time, you need coordination on the ground. And this reveals a lot of problems in relation to in the quality of that coordination between the component parts of the UK. So in response to the coronavirus, we saw improved communications between Scotland and Wales, Northern Ireland and Westminster, particularly regular meetings, sometimes several times a day between chief medical officers and certain politicians. But the difficulty then was putting that into action. And so we saw all the component parts of the UK go into lockdown in March last year at more or less the same time, along the same lines and conditions, which, as Anthony's pointed out, brought some tensions in Northern Ireland. But the challenge was then maintaining them, and indeed softening them coming out of lockdown just revealed the differences. Most particularly amid all of this, because what this situation has done with the importance of these borders within the UK, we've seen increasing tensions over the questions of the powers and the profile that these component parts of the UK have. So Nicola Sturgeon as the First Minister of Scotland and Mark Drakeford as the First Minister of Wales have grown hugely in their popularity as a response to the coronavirus pandemic, something that has obviously been seen with alarm by Westminster and London. One thing that's been notable is that public information briefings and from the UK government have often overlooked the differences within the UK, leading to increased confusion about what would be happening in its various parts. Notably, borders have become seen, that connectivity that these internal borders bring has become seen as a type of risk. And this brings to the fore new instincts and concepts within the UK that genuinely hadn't been there before, particularly if you think of the Wales-England border. What we see now in this particular phase of the coronavirus pandemic is that softening borders requires action and coordination on both sides. And this is where we're beginning to see the political tensions overriding the questions of pragmatism. For Northern Ireland, it remains caught between, and it is a really interesting question of, well, what's more important when it comes to borders in a time of pandemic? Is it territorial connections and managing those? And Anthony has explained what this means, what that connectivity means in territorial terms, or rather is it the overarching state and the role that the external borders of the country play in terms of increasing the protection and this health and safety of the population, and of course that all-important matter of the finances as well. That difference in tension between focusing on the UK state versus the island of Ireland, unsurprisingly, has been manifested within the Northern Ireland executive, not least in decisions and slow decision making, and of course it's also become manifest in political debate as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katy. Thank you for giving us also an insight about the importance of political structures and governmental organization in the management of the COVID crisis. I think this is I didn't do this on purpose, but our next water region is the one between France and Germany, and we have here two very different state organizations, one very centralized and the other one very federal. And the question has been also, what is better? Is it better to have a federal organization in order to cope with a virus or the pandemic? And that also means that you have different approaches within Germany between the different Länder, or is it better to have a centralized approach, as have the French, for example? And so it's you seem to kind of mention this as one of the important issues also within the UK, which is normally very centralized, but has, of course, the devolution governments, and the question who is more popular is also one. For example, in Germany, at one point, some of the minister presidents have been very popular. The one of Bavaria, for example, Markus Söder was very popular for his management. Okay, I think Anthony has told me that Bernard is still a host. Bernard, and so I don't know whether Clarisse, can you try and show your PowerPoint? I hope it's going to work. Yes, it does. I don't know why Bernard is always put as a host, but it works. Okay, Clarisse, you have the floor first for our Upper Rhine region.
So, hello everybody. So, thanks, yes, for giving me the floor. I was really interested by the presentation before, and I recognize in most of them. So we have very many common points on all our European regions. As Birte said, I will speak about the French-German border and explain the results of an impact assessment in the Upper Rhine, and after that, Frédéric Pirot will also complete with the legal aspects, legal perspective, and explain the several levels of coordination in crisis management. So, so you see the card. Where is the Upper Rhine
Clarisse
located? Yes.
Can you just you have your PowerPoint in we can see the comments. Could you put it in the presentation for everyone? Yes, sure. That's better. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, good. It's better. I have it in bigger. Good. Thank you. So yes, you see better the card also. Where is the trinational Upper Rhine region? So it's all Strasbourg, Kehl, Basel, in the center of Europe, of West Europe. And last year I did the same exercise as Anthony at our border, and it was an impact assessment of the first wave. But now we are 1 year later, and I would like to also to share my experience of living in Kehl in the second and the third wave. And behind me, you see the bridge between Kehl and Strasbourg that I couldn't cross many times in the in the last months. So let's begin. So first, I explain you what was the border in the first wave and in the second and third wave, and after that I will focus on the lessons learned and what has changed in our region. So let's remember in March 2020 it was the crisis, the surprise. Nobody was prepared for this pandemic, like everywhere in Europe. I think Jean and other, you already said the neighbor was a synonym for danger. And so we had really national reflexes and national rules. And concretely for the Upper Rhine region, it had meant 90 days border controls, and in sometimes also closed border. I'll explain David. And it had also meant discrimination by country of residence. So if you live, for instance, in Germany, you have a right to do this and this, but if you live in France, you don't have a right. Or in the contrary also. It was also the beginning of quarantine rules, and also the public transportation was interrupted. So the cross-border mobility was really had decreased. Positive thing in our region was the reactive mobilization of local and national institutions to improve this coordination. which was maybe not perfect, but they have tried to better it. So the situation in March was not the same in the months after that. And there were some exemptions, and it was 90 days border controls. Doesn't mean that nobody could cross the border during 3 months. So let's see concretely what it meant for the people. And in your impact assessment, we wanted to show it, who was concerned by those border controls. I really liked the expression of Jean Peyrony, who said we should start from persons with local cross-border communities. And all those persons, it's what we found out in our impact assessment. The cross-border workers were well known in our region, so they were not ignored, and they were, at the first time, they were included in the exemptions to cross the border. But there are also other inhabitants in the border region. You have 2,000 cross-border pupils, go to school in the neighbor countries, and for more than 4 million citizens are living less than 20 kilometers from the border, and they are used to cross the border for everything, to go shopping, because they own a land, an apartment, or because they prefer to go to the doctor in the neighbor country, and of course families and unmarried couples. All those people were forgotten at the beginning. After that, you had exemptions for them, but in our impact assessments, we couldn't really show how many people it is, and it might explain why they were forgotten. We could only assess how many of them ask questions and or complain or say they had difficulties, but maybe there are really more than them. And also for companies, naturally, the interruption of cross-border mobility was really bad. On the right of my presentation, maybe you don't see it. We could assess a really big reduction of traffic and show that it was stronger than on other national roads, up to 80% in April. Unfortunately, I don't have figures like Anthony for this year. I don't know, maybe this information is disponible somewhere. So it was last year, March, April 2020. What has changed in between? What did we learn? You see some pictures which we were used to see in those times. And I really agree with all the other presentators there. And it's the same as at the French Belgium border. Last year we had those closed border or strict border controls, but now we have a confusion. And the rules are really changing very often. We have not more time. Maybe I will not explain everything that you see on this year, but you can see that it's changed very often. And the positive aspect is that after the mid of June 2020, there was no reintroduction of border controls or of systematic border controls. It means you have maybe sometimes the police on the border, but it's not the rule. And and there are no closed bridge, for instance. So that was a progress. And also the public transportation is still running. So the mobility is a bit easier. And as in Romania, we have also the 24-hour rule and a 30-kilometer rule, and it's not the same. So in Germany, you have a 24-hour rule, allowing people to travel in the cross-border region without 10 days quarantine after that. And in France, it's not the same. You don't need a PCR test if you travel less than 30 kilometers. It was not possible to have the same rule on both sides. But I used to do this presentation in November, and I was quite enthusiastic at this time because of this 24-hour rule. But in between, it had been restricted in Baden-Württemberg, and it was forbidden to go shopping or to go for tourism or to go to the hairdresser. I don't know. So it creates more confusion. And as I speak with people living in Kehl, in the border city of Strasbourg, they don't know anymore if they have a right to cross the border or not. And it's quite a complicated atmosphere. And this has changed last week. So now we came back to an easier rule in the whole of Germany. The next year is a comparison between April 2020 and April 2021, only for Kehl and Strasbourg, because each territory is a bit different. So I focus only on those examples. What has changed for the everyday life of people? If they want to cross the border. Very concrete, you can see that commuters in last year and now could cross the border, but they have not the same obligations. So only them can say what was better. Last year, they had to fill out many forms. They felt discriminated now also, and they need more time to cross the border because of the duration of controls. They also couldn't go shopping in Germany to buy food for their lunch. It was also forbidden. So now this is possible. They don't need more time to face the border controls because most of the time there is no police, but they need time to do a test, what's called an antigen test or Schnelltest. It's free of charge, but it takes time. And maybe you don't like to do a test. It's twice a week. For family of couples, the situation has really is better than last year, because last year it was impossible to see each other. So now it's possible, but you have also the obligation of testing, and this insecurity or confusion feeling is still there. And for consumers, it's in fact they think it's forbidden. Yeah. For if you look at the law, it's a bit it's not really forbidden, but the feeling is that you can cross the border for this. But in the months as it was allowed, you see the consumers come back to their habits before the pandemic. There is no real stop of habits. I would like to conclude with a more positive statement. Because really progressed between the first and the third wave, and some things were also really useful to deal with this crisis situation. Good thing was the information of citizens about the rules, about the pandemic measures in the neighbor country by a network of cross-border information structures, or also by local administration who informs about the neighbors. Also, we achieved fiscal and social bilateral agreements to protect cross-border workers. We can also remember of the first wave, the solidarity of Germany and Switzerland, who accepted to take care of 62 patients from France. And it was without a legal frame. It was really an act of solidarity, a political engagement, and they hadn't time to look at the law. Maybe Frederick can say something. Good practice were also the Peyrony network, what organized the cross-border tracking of infections and a common monitoring of incidence rate. If you remember, in March or April, there wasn't a common definition to count the cases, and so it improved, and it's a contribution to the trust between countries to speak and to understand the figures. Now a good practice is also the local coordination for testing, and for instance to allow inhabitants of France to test in Germany or the other side, to create centers for cross-border populations. That's also a sign of dialogue and coordination at local level. If there's questions, I can later explain, but there were really a lot of cooperation and dialogue, and also in the shadow. It was not in the media, but there were some initiatives, and the results in the second and third wave are Kompromiss. Do you say that in English? Kompromisslösung. So France and Germany tried to speak, and they had to find a solution. And yeah, maybe it's not perfect, but they try to leave the border open, but to restrict the mobility in order to protect their citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will try to share.
I leave Frederick, yeah.
Thank you, Clarisse. I will try to share my screen. My screen. Yeah. So I will just give you a little bit of analysis of the experience of the COVID crisis from a legal perspective. Non, ça c'est le mien. Just have to find how to say, yeah. I will base my analysis on a certain number of interviews that you can find on the Trisan magazine, which is published and that you can download from the internet. And I will begin by the Franco-German Swiss conference. When you read the interview, you understand that they are pleading for a sort of new deal for border regions. As we have seen in many examples today, what was a surprise in March was the fact that it was a unilateral reaction by the different member states, and sometimes also at a local level. The second important thing, according to this conference, is that you have numerous interactions in border regions, as we have seen in all the examples developed today. But in spite of the fact that you have on many borders, you have many institutions and they have a certain experience of cross-border cooperation. But apparently, during the crisis, the feeling was that you had a lack of information and a lack of transparency between the member states. And that's something which has been translated in numerous unilateral measures for controlling free movement at the border. The second experience is the one of the Rhine Council, the three national parliaments, and its Health Commission. So the feeling of the Rhine Council and the Health Commission was that at the beginning they were very surprised, and apparently they were not prepared to solve such a crisis. But after some days, it was quite quick. They organized mutual information through video conferences, and apparently it was a good means to get a sort of smoother flow of information between each side of the border. One of their conclusion is that, of course, it's a problem at the border, but also beyond borders. It's not just a problem on the 20 kilometers that Clarisse has mentioned. It's also a problem between member states and between regions. They also had the impression that one of the problems for the institution was to fight against fake news. So they are pleading for two things which are important from a legal point of view, is that they are pleading for an implication of local authorities in the framework of the measures decided to fight against the pandemia. And that's something which is interesting, because we have seen, for example, on the Irish border, that in spite of sort of local vision can also be a problem for free movement and for cross-border cooperation. But they also concluded that there is a strong need for a better cooperation between local authorities. So apparently, in spite of the fact that we have many procedures, it was not enough to fight against the pandemia. And the third experience is the one from the Euro-District Pamina. For them, this crisis is a major crisis. It is the major crisis since the Second World War. And for them, there is a clear need of an urgency transboundary protocol. So one of the things which seems to be important is that to fight against this kind of crisis, you really need to have a formal procedure, a crisis procedure, which is very precisely defined and discussed at the local level. But they also insist on something which is important and which is also one of the lessons of the crisis, is that we need also a principle of equal treatment for all citizens of border region. Not just a principle of non-discrimination in each member state, as it is the case since the beginning of the European Union, but a principle of equal treatment for all citizens of a same border region. What has been done at the local level is a pact of mutual assistance, which was decided in November 2020. What is interesting is that in this pact of mutual assistance, we find this idea, which is very commonly developed, as it is the border as a laboratory of life in common. We see in the pact how vital is this border zone for free movement. They also plead for a formalization of crisis management, which means a specific procedure and to have a sort of urgent procedure, and the need to organize more cooperation, more coordination between the local authorities. We also have mentioned this, I think it's on the Romanian and Hungarian border, the vital importance of robust health data. So this is something which can be decided also with the Aachen Treaty and what they called in the Pact of Mutual Assistance the Aachen Spirit, the Treaty of Aachen Spirit. And one of the things which has been decided on a bilateral basis by the Franco-German governments is the Gaia X Initiative, which is an initiative for a common infrastructure of health data. And the idea is that with this infrastructure we can develop a sovereign data-driven economy, which will be important also for health. At the level of the European Union, because that's something we did not directly discuss this afternoon, but we can observe a huge amount of soft law. I think we have written many texts during the last year, a lot of soft law, a lot of recommendation, a lot of guidelines, a lot of toolkit which have been developed, especially by the European Commission, but also by the Council of Ministers. At the European level, after the surprise of the unilateral closing of borders by each member states, they develop an immediate reaction and an adaptation of the cohesion fund. That's also something which has been underlined this afternoon. I wanted also to underline the creation of green lines for free movement of essential goods and services, and at that time it was really a question of essential goods and services because they were vital simply for life. And of course the recovery perspective, but a lot of best practices from Trisan, from the MOT or the CESCI, which have been recognized at the European level to show what the Commission is calling the resilience of cross-border cooperation, and that's something which is also interesting. The Council of Ministers try to develop a coordinated or a more coordinated approach since October 2020 with the Reopen EU program. It is a centralized and standardized information on the situation in all countries. And what is interesting, it's just the dia before, is the kind of map which have been used, I think, by Anthony, and that's interesting because with this adaptive maps, that was the map of yesterday. So you see that you have more orange than red in the European Union, which is a good sign. And the idea is to centralize information, but also to work on a common way to calculate, for example, the rate of diffusion of the virus or some data which are very important to fight against the crisis. And the very last change by the European Union is the announcement which has been made on the 11th of November 2020, which is the European Health Union. You can see very briefly on the dia what are the main points of this communication, but I think it's interesting because it gives more margin of maneuver for the European Union facing cross-border health threats. So the idea is really to have a common procedure in case of pandemia. You have more powers which are given to the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control of the European Medicines Agency, and you see in on the 6th of May 2021, a strategy on the COVID-19 therapeutics have been presented by the Commission, because we all know that we have a certain number of vaccines, but now we need to have medicine, and that's very pharmaceuticals to fight really against and to cure the COVID-19, and that's the next step which should be taken by the Commission.
Thank you, Frédéric, for this very concise, but I think very important presentation, which also kind of leads to the measures at EU level. I think they are important if we want to compare our border regions and to take into account that most of our states are members, I'm not looking at Anthony, of the European Union, and that the European Union has also some competences and some soft law on how to combat the pandemic. I would like to, there has been a question, but I can't get out of this presentation. We are in a studio, but it's so complex, the studio, that we can't figure out. That's it. I think there was one question on the chat, but I think I prefer to first, because the last presentation will be on Canada, US, and that will be quite different. So I prefer to actually ask Martin to just carry on with a Danish German example, and then we can follow that up with the questions. If you are okay with this, Martin, is that okay for you?
Yes. I will share. I think I can.
Great.
Yes, I
Great.
can.
Yes. So you have the floor, and then we can follow on with the questions after your presentation.
Yes, much is similar to what we have heard in the other presentations. I'm taking you to this Danish-German border region. The interesting cases here, as with the Hungary-Romanian, that it's a post-World War I border. It was designed it was drawn in 1920. It was drawn here, and dividing this former Duchy of Schleswig. We have the old border of the Holy Roman Empire going down here at the river, and then the border between Denmark and Germany after the Danish-German War in 1864. And then in 1920, this national issue was solved, plebiscite, and so on. And this was going to be celebrated in 2020. So the idea was that 2020 should be the year of the Danish-German border, of overcoming it, of moving from enmity to friendship, Danish-German year of cultural friendship. It should be so great. There were many events planned, and then came the pandemic. The narrative goes that we have like this resolution of a national conflict, that it has been a democratic procedure when the border was drawn because there was a plebiscite, that those people who didn't agree with the plebiscite could become national minorities, so like living as Danes in Germany or living as Germans and Danes. And then 2020, we were going to celebrate all this. And then suddenly we have the physical closure, which this is actually the third most important crossing when it comes to cars, and here, and it was closed. It's also the most important crossing for border shoppers, because this is a crossing you go when on the German side you have all the supermarkets which sell a lot of products to Danes at cheap prices. We had in March this not coordinated closure. Germany reacted 2 days later by closing also. Rather dramatic, because it was, in fact, in the beginning, only commuters that were allowed to cross. Later on, it was extended to children and parents and life partners and other people. And here, this crossing I was there 2 or 3 times during the closure, and there were always people there meeting. So it became kind of a cross-border cafe where people who couldn't cross met on the border crossing. We have this elderly couple which made it to the New York Times and to many other news outlets. They were also meeting at the border every day, having a joint lunch, here. And I think the most interesting thing was that suddenly we could see this disruption of a cross-border living space, and we could see all the relations. I mean, we were always talking about computers, we were talking about the minorities, and something like people who had moved across, but there were many other aspects of living a border region as a cross-border living space that suddenly were disrupted, about house ownership, about agriculture, about farmers having fields on both sides, having some material on one side in the shed, boat owners, Germans having the sailboat in a Danish port. Many small-scale relations suddenly were disrupted. And this suddenly became visible. It was also that the two minorities became very active in arguing, we have to stop this, we need to have an open border. And eventually in Denmark, I think they were heard. Germany is a big country, so the German minority in Denmark does not have that much influence in Berlin. But the Danish minority, if they shut up, if they voice up, then Copenhagen somehow listens, funny enough. So what happened is that we developed a border bureaucracy, but we have talked about this before, but suddenly there were more and more exemptions on who was allowed to cross and who wasn't. And this extended during the summer with what I would call a COVID border regime. It was never a total opening of the border, like going back to pre-COVID Schengen, but there were more reasons to cross into Denmark, at least for German tourists, or it was minimum 6 nights route, which was actually in effect until sometime in July, August, and the border was reopened fully in September with a new system of yellow and like what the Romanians have in Hungary, like with yellow, orange, and red countries, based on infections. There was a special status for the border region in the way that Schleswig-Holstein was considered a region. Germany had its regional statuses too in how they classify risk areas. And so it was pretty open in the summer, but there were still controls and quite a few traffic jams actually because of these controls. Then we have the third wave starting in the fall, culminating in December actually with another Danish lockdown. Shortly before Christmas. Lessons learned. The approach was different this time. The approach was more on a keep the border open paradigm, but there were still plenty of rules and there was still control. This crossing I have here is actually the one I like to do on my bike. It's also on this little video that I have that has been uploaded to Frontem. And here you can see that there is a Danish police car on the other side now, and there is a sign here that this is actually closed. It was open from 10 to 6, I think, something like this. The argument there was that at that time there were very high incidence numbers of infections in Flensburg. Since then, this crossing has actually been reopened, but we have actually a very extensive set of rules and bureaucracy, test requirements, and so on. But you know all this. But the confusion is that these rules change all the time. So it's actually almost every week you have to check what is actually valid now. What are the rules now? What do I need to cross? Am I allowed to cross? I am following discussions in some Facebook groups with these topics, and some people are really confused. Yes, and future, I have made this very short today. What about the future? And this is probably the most interesting development we have. I just read, just a few minutes ago, I read that the Danish Minister of Integration, I mean, Schengen is renegotiated at the moment, which many people are not really aware of, and that the Danish Minister of European Integration argued that Interior, he argued that it should be up to, or Denmark will motion that there should be more freedom for national governments to close the borders or to control the borders. So there is this control paradigm, and Denmark is a very centralized and very digitalized country. So what is coming now, it's in Denmark, or it has already been introduced, is an electronic COVID passport, which you need for almost everything. If you, for almost everything except leaving your home, you will in the future, or at the moment, you need this COVID passport, which means it documents whether you have been have had the infection and are immune, whether you have been vaccinated, and if you have not been vaccinated, when you last have been tested, and all the test results you have had. So every restaurant, cinema, at a sports stadium, I mean, soccer is with spectators again, football is with spectators again in Denmark. I'm still hoping I can see Aarhus' last game of the season on Thursday. Not quite sure yet, but this is still happening again. But then you need this COVID passport. This, of course, raises issues for border region residents, because it's a digital Danish passport, which you cannot have unless you have a digital Danish registry number, which you don't have unless you live in Denmark or are a commuter to Denmark. So in principle, they accept the German test certificates, but in effect, it's not always it's not really sure if a restaurant you want to go to accepts it. And so you are always kind of, there is a moment of insecurity if you don't have this Danish COVID passport. And then the Danish government has announced that as soon as the EU COVID passport is ready, the border will be opened for the EU if you have this EU digital passport. So it's a situation where we will have kind of, or at least this is a Danish policy. Germany has not been that outspoken yet how they actually want to manage this in the future, but the Danish policy is rather clear, or very clear, that we will have digital control, and this will be the way how we store mobility in the on our Danish borders. Actually, thanks. Birte, I can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. Okay. No, sorry. I was just saying that what was interesting in your presentation was the last part about the smart borders, and how how smart borders can be used in the context of the pandemic, and how this could also take on a European dimension with a kind of EU passport. I also appreciated your small comment, which I heard, and I hope the others heard as well, about the video for Frontum, because most of you, but not all of you, have produced a small video on experiences of COVID, or on COVID and management of borders, and I would like to take the opportunity to invite, because I have the whole network here, those who have not yet done the video. You just have to take your iPhone and put it in a paysage format, and then and have an idea of what you can do to describe your perception of borders in times of pandemic, and send it to us so we can put it on the Frontum website. Yes, but before we move on to the yes, Martin, yeah?
There's one comment. Birte has very helpful student aids when it comes to editing the video, because I needed help with that. So don't hesitate to send in something that's not perfect.
I think this is something we will remember, this video during the pandemic. I think it's an interesting way of, how we can also get involved personally in the project. I can see that Emmanuel is getting ready for his presentation, and so I would like to invite him, because I don't want to be stuck with time, because we have the next webinar starting at 6. So please, Emmanuel, we are very, very excited to hear about your border in transatlantic spheres. How do you manage COVID between Canada and the United States?
Well, good morning, everybody. And let me try to get at the beginning. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So I can speak freely. So I divided my talk in on three different areas. I could not resist talking about the special issue that big review did. So I just want to show you all. I guess you won't see it because of my screen unless you see me. We did a special issue on COVID. We have 22 border regions from the world that have been discussed there. And there is also, I think, an interesting introduction. At least I've had very positive comment on it. And one of the staggering findings is that most states close borders. Not that it's a surprising finding for the people who are on this panel. The second thing I wanted to discuss is a paper I wrote actually for the Canadian International Council on the reaction of EU member states to the COVID, which is the closure of the border. And I'll talk about this just for 1 minute as well. And then I'll focus on the British Columbia, Washington, the Cascadia region, as it was asked, because I think it's also quite interesting. And you'll see that I could almost write a paper on this now, but my data is quite different from what has been described here. So on the big review, very quickly, one of the things that really surprised me, I have to tell you, and it still is surprising me now because we're running a worldwide survey on hundreds of diets across the world, and we have thousands of answers now. I'm waiting for us to reach 5,000 answers so that we have a bit of continental solidity in the different continents, the different parts of the world. And I'd like to have at least 1,000 per continent. So it's a bit difficult. But one of the things that is basically the general finding is that most states, out of nearly 200 states, closed their borders. Most states closed their borders, but most states had no staff that would know about health issues at the border either. So the general finding is that the kind of closure has almost nothing to do with health issues, or at least that states demonstrate an incapacity to deal with health issues at the border. Because the officials that closed the border know nothing about health issues, and certainly they knew very little about border issues. Another contradiction, which I think is very important and also quite relevant, is that the World Health Organization never, ever suggested the closure of borders. It actually fought the closure of borders. And the World Health Organization had recommendations from the very beginning that focused on hand washing, individual distancing, and later wearing masks, but also the idea that you had to detect very, very early. They published, and I mean as early as within a few weeks of the pandemic being identified as a possible worldwide pandemic, they were disclosing how to test and how even very poorly equipped countries could create tests to test individuals, identify virus carriers, and isolate them. And the procedure that was recommended was always to isolate infected individuals, to contact trace, and to isolate those people. But the recommendation of closing a border was actually never the case, and many times it was actually fought. And the idea here is that the biological boundary moved inside communities. It's something that was very poorly understood by state officials, very poorly understood, basically generally understood by officials that have no idea how pandemics, in a way, have their own and virus have their own ways of circulating across the world. And the conclusion that I propose is that this is a vivid reminder of the cosmopolitan condition of humanity. In other words, we're not the only species on the world, and we have to take care of that situation. We have to politically, from a policy perspective, become fully aware of this. We have to change the way we use and experiment with the world, because this is kind of the backlash, and inability to control a pandemic is also an inability to understand a pandemic, and it's also an inability to live in a cosmopolitan world, right? It's kind of an ignorance that seems to be repeated many times. Now, what I have read, and I wrote a paper for the CIC, which I referenced at the end of my talk, the Canadian International Council, on the EU answer. And one of the things that really shocked me, and I used different EU documents, parliamentary documents to write this talk, is that most EU member states closed their border, implemented internal and external travel bans, and went beyond this because of the different quality and quantity and diversity of lockdowns, right? So boundary lines came inside the different states. The boundary lines came inside the regions, the counties, the cities, the neighborhoods of the different states. And very often it was extremely confusing for the average EU citizen. And that's one of the great findings, I would say, and a very important finding that all of your talks are discussing, right? Is that relationship between citizens or residents of EU member states and the EU member states' successive, confusing policies and the kind of enforcements that came with it. And the fact that all of these measures actually contravene the Schengen Code, which allowed for exceptional measures as long as it doesn't go beyond 2 months. And I point the finger here because it was, it's part of a report published by the European Parliament now that very specific wealthy countries, in a way, implemented measures that were unlawful for durations that went way beyond 2 months in most cases. With fines ranging from a few €100 to 10,000 euros, for instance, in Cyprus. Now, one of the things that I think we can almost generalize about the EU answer is that there was no public health response, but a securitization response, right? So I think, for me, this is one of the most important findings about the policy answers across the EU member states. It seems to me that it speaks very, very loudly to us, scholars and students of this situation, of, in a way, the handover states by securitization lobbies, the security and policing lobbies, and also, the preset minds of policymakers that have, in a way, followed on the 2015 migration crisis. Unfortunately, I see a link here where the closure of borders to prevent foreign individuals or foreign bodies, viruses to enter the EU is kind of perceived as a possible response. I have already discussed my second bullet point, so I'm not going to elaborate on this, but it's quite interesting to see how diverse these closures were, not just in airport and seaports and territorial boundary lines, border gates, and so on and so forth, but how they basically invaded the multiple territories of EU member states, going inside neighborhoods away from the boundary line, and how basically restriction of mobility, including electronic surveillance, as Martin discussed, but a number of you as well discussed in different fashion, right, have been generalized without ever really having serious consideration for what they can do to actually effectively prevent the spread of the virus, especially when we know very clearly that the World Health Organization policy response recommended were always the, in a way, location of virus holders and their isolation only. It was never to close neighborhoods. It was never to close cities. It was never to close regions. Now, as Frédéric Berrod highlighted, one of the things that we can say is that member states generally perform very poorly because of those policies, but the Commission emerged as a stronger Commission despite the vaccination fiasco, in part because it has been able to mobilize not only new legislation at the level of the Center for Disease Control, but also the EU for Health 21-27, which is the largest health plan the EU has ever had with a budget of 5 billion. And obviously, it's just a foot in the door to go beyond and to implement the policies that Frédéric was discussing, which is access, policy, health access for all across the EU. So I see great hope here, but I think that, you know, from a worldwide perspective, as a Jean Monnet professor, when I look at this and when I look at the rest of the world looking at EU member states, what most people, policymakers, are thinking across the world is that EU member states now need the EU to be able to modernize, to be able to offer the right kind of policies. I think that's a really interesting question that some of us need to have, you know, further debates and further and probably inquire more about this. Now, in British Columbia, there was a general policy very quickly to basically impose a you know, you'll see the detail of the measures, but I want to highlight this, what is here in gray, in white, and in yellow, which are hospital regions. And the hospital regions of British Columbia basically became the new travel regions of British Columbians. That means I live on the island, at the tip end of the island, actually, in the south. And I could only travel across the island in my hospital region. All of the other hospital regions were close to me, and obviously international travel was absolutely impossible. It was not possible. It was a university policy, it was a provincial policy, it was a university policy. And so it's very important to realize this, because then that's the principle, and everything else basically is about exceptions. And that's what I want to highlight before I give you some numbers about the situation here in North America. You'll see some of the findings are actually, as Birte said, quite different from what has happened in Europe. So the enforcement at first was very much educational, and it's very important to realize this, is that even though there were roadblocks and, you know, there were checks on the road and so on and so forth, I would say that during most of the summer, the last summer, these were basically information type enforcements, and there was no real finding unless the police officers were convinced that this, you know, the individual or the individuals that were arrested or were stopped at the side of the road had already received the information a number of times, then it was just primarily educational. It's very important to say this because in British Columbia, the government has been very active to present the situation of the progress and the evolution of the pandemic in British Columbia across the different health regions twice a week. And there was both political and technical information that was given to us by the Ministry of Health, by the Premier, and primarily, I should say, by our Chief Medical Officer, Bonnie Henry, who spoke at every single briefing. So the Premier of British Columbia and the Minister of Health generally spoke up to about 5 minutes each, but the top bureaucrat in the province spoke about 40 to 45 minutes at every single briefing, twice a week, ever since the beginning of March. So it's very important to realize this, because they used information to convince and discipline and organize basically social discipline across the province. They didn't really enforce. And so you have here on the PowerPoint a description of the kind of things that could happen and have happened and have been practiced since April of last year. And you can see that you can be fined if you, for instance, if you were known to have disrespected some of the rules. Now, there were reasons to, or exceptions, if you want, to those rules, and you can see them here, reasons for essential travel. So whatever was labeled essential travel would be exceptions to those rules, right? And you can see that if you're returning home, for instance, as it was my case, for instance, in April of last year, at the end of March of last year, I came back from Europe and I was placed in quarantine for 2 weeks. You know, it was basically self-imposed to the extent that everybody, including in my own neighborhood, everybody respected those rules, I found, in a very surprising way, extremely well, right? There was no generalized sense that, you know, there was no sense anywhere that people were not respecting the rules. So I was quite surprised by this when I was, for instance, reading the media. And you can see that there are well-listed reasons for essential travel, and that commercial transportation of goods is one of them. And this is where I want to, in a way, point the finger to. It's because certain industries, as a result of this set of rules, if you want, suffered much more than others. And so we can almost identify the areas of the economy that has suffered, because generally the transportation of goods, selling and buying, has not suffered from the pandemic. So I'm going to illustrate this a little bit. When we look at international arrival across Canada, now the reason I'm not focusing in on just the Vancouver airport is that this data, this pan-Canadian data, comes from StatScan and is really shows very little variation across the different provinces, right? So even though Canada is a federal country, and even though there are small variations across the different provinces, I would say the two most extreme variations are Alberta and British Columbia, even though they're next to each other as provinces. Alberta, I would say, is the province where most of the federal and health rules were least followed, and British Columbia is the province where they were respected the most, if you want, across the country. It's quite interesting to see, as you can see, that international travel has really fallen very drastically across Canada. And when we compare to 2019, we can see that it's basically been very flat, and it's been, you know, basically international travel arrival into Canada has been divided by 6 for some airports across the country. So as a result of this, you know, one of the industry that suffered the most, obviously, is tourism. So you can see a very sharp downturn on tourism. The tourism industry, hotels and restaurants primarily, right, but also tourism sites on our island, for instance, and in British Columbia, there are some sites that have, that basically only live because of tourism, like the Butchart Gardens that are, you know, very well known and receive about 5 million people a year. This year, they've received only locals because nobody would come and visit them. And you have the data here. You can see very well that even Canadian tourism, Canadian residents, right, have not moved very much. You can see the data here. It's quite clear that April, May, June, and even during the summer vacation, the tourism is basically completely flat. The July, August, September is very, very low, and that we have, you know, very, very few travelers compared to July and August of last year, when you have thousands of arrival per day during those months. They were in hundreds during the last year and the last month. Now, one of the things that I think is really worth highlighting is this data on non-resident returning to Canada. These are basically truck drivers. Just to speak really bluntly and be very clear about this, what you realize is that when we look at truck drivers and when we look at people who work and operate other types of transportation means, such as airplanes, ships, and train, you can see that most of them, in a way, are quite active, a little less active than they were in the previous year, but after a significant dip in April, the numbers are coming back up. The kind of numbers that are not coming back up, and explain basically the lower chart, is because within Canada and within non-resident crews in Canada, Canadian and non-resident crews basically didn't operate as much as they used to. In other words, within the country, there was less transportation between the country and the rest of the world. And the data that I am showing you now even goes in greater details here. What we see here is basically, sorry, I forgot to add one thing here, which I think is very important, and in a way is the reason why truckers and trucking corporations have thrived during the pandemic, is that e-commerce in North America between Canada and the US has expanded by 75%. So it didn't double, but most people in Canada used e-commerce as a way to provide for themselves, and instead of going shopping, they directly themselves, they used access to e-commerce facilities, even I would say at takeout restaurants, and so on and so forth. And that is a fundamental, in a way, transformation of the economy, I would say, in North America. It's not just Canadian, but it's something that StatScan, for instance, identified. Stats Canada, obviously, the agency that looks at all of this, but also other agencies and quite a number of my colleagues who study these phenomenons. And when we look at cross-border traffic and the freight volumes, one of the things that I found quite surprising is that I showed you the number of operators, right? The truck drivers. When you look at the quantity of goods, we see that there is an increase by about 10% of quantity of goods as of June. In other words, there is a quite clear dip in the numbers in April and May. And then in June and July, we are basically 10% higher than we were earlier, which this slide now shows you. So these are freight markets, and we're looking at an average of 15 different freight markets across the country. In other words, it's train plus trucks. And you can see together that the blue line demonstrates that, compared to the previous volumes in the past, right? So for 2021, you can see that freight markets as of July are very high, and they're systematically higher. You can see the freight market for two of the markets in orange and in green, and you can see the total for the 15 different markets, and you can see that the blue line is much higher than, for instance, the orange line of 2018-19, 2019-20. So for 2020-21, the freight markets have really caught up in July. And as of July, August, and September, they basically are, significantly higher than they were in the past. And here's the data I used for that talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this very, very interesting. You not only presented the Canadian situation, but also gave us a kind of outside evaluation of the European situation, which I hadn't even asked for, but which you as a specialist of the European Union can, of course, give us. And I think I have one regret about this webinar. It's when you do webinars, you forget about breaks, that you also need maybe a break, and you kind of pack so much into so short amount of time, and so we don't have enough time to discuss, because we have also another webinar which is starting at 6 o'clock on our health issues, and that is really a pity, because I think it was from the content, it was a very, very useful webinar. We had all of it was useful. The introduction by Jean, and also the different inputs from the border regions. And I am a little bit frustrated that we cannot do together now the comparison, which we should have done by discussing it now. But let me just say maybe 2 or 3 sentences of conclusion from my point of view. I think that we can, Jean has pointed out that border regions are very specific, but I do think that the pandemic has also some common traits, shown some common traits in the different border regions. We are confronted always in Europe, and Emmanuel has pointed this out, with responses of security, bordering, sometimes again debordering, rebordering, and a privilege of this bordering, debordering, rebordering with regard to health issues. So that is a common trend. We have also seen in the different border regions a high complexity of rules that are not the same on one side of the border and on the other side of the border. And so there is a great need for information for the border population, because they have to be informed on rules that count for both borders, and also on the rules that change in function of the situation of the virus. And the third conclusion I would like to draw is that maybe not everybody agrees on this, and we can take this in a discussion later on up again, but there seems to be a little bit of learning process from the first lockdown to the second lockdown. There seems to this cross-border resilience, which has been underlined, and the invention of some forms of cross-border cooperation to deal with the pandemic. And cross-border cooperation in terms of implication of local actors in this process, which work together, who work together with national and sometimes even with the European level of governance. So this learning process has improved the situation at the European borders during the second lockdown. I think I would, this is my personal conclusion, I would draw, but I would invite all of us, I mean, we are a network, think of your own conclusions in function of what has been presented today. I feel that we are not at the end of this analysis. I think we can take this up again. We have further occasions. We will have our border conferences at each European border. And I think we can take this up. I will try and do a kind of summary of what has been said today, and maybe with the help of Marc-Antoine. And we will center around and see if we cannot take this up again, this discussion, in our next seminar, which will take place. Probably the first one is going to be the one on the Franco-German border, beginning of October. Then let me thank you, all of you, for your patience and for my mistake of not having foreseen a coffee break in between presentations. And well, thanks for the Canadians again for having got up so early in the morning, and thanks for all of our European partners. I'm so lucky to have so nice partners in the Frontum network. And thank you for Frédéric, Marc-Antoine, for the help, and for the university's help here, the logistic, Monsieur Dancer. Merci beaucoup for the technical help.